having people with us on Zoom today as well as in person. This is a wonderful crowd that we have, and this shows the interest in the topic that we have today. We know that the Anti-Racism Task Force has been meeting, and they are going to be making a presentation to us today. And I will tell you that they are going to be asking people who are here participating to have some response on the program. So be aware of that and have your listening ears on, and questions, however, we will just be taking a bit at the very end, because questioning while we're recording is difficult. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce one of the co-chairs of our Anti-Racism Task Force, and that is Kathryn Johnson. So, Kathryn?
And Neal, has Neal checked in, or Rachel?
Not checked out, that's for sure.
Okay. Well, just imagine I'm a panel of 3. And it's good that I put the outline together. So it's great to be here. It's always great to be here. Actually, I have some friends I want to introduce in the front row, friends visiting from New England who have long heard about Dumbarton's and are wanting to check us out. And I'm delighted Lois Hoppy and Marge Moeller are friends, longtime friends from New England. So welcome to you and any other visitors this morning. Do you have anybody else that we want to introduce? Or no? Okay, great. So, yes, I am co-chair of Dumbarton's Anti-Racism Task Force. The current task force has just been meeting for a few months. So I want to back up a bit, because obviously our work as a congregation against racism has been much more long-term than just the last few months. So let me just very quickly review some of the things that we've been involved in that I've been aware of, and I'm sure there's more. But just to remind us of our work through the Washington Interfaith Network that we're a part of. Elaine is our liaison there, and Joan, Elaine and Joan, and many of the issues that WIN deals with. I think particularly this year on the agenda of WIN is Black equity through homeownership and affordable housing and building generational wealth. So our involvement through WINS is often addresses issues of racism. Another example of a coalition ministry that we're involved in is the Georgetown Ministry Center, which is another coalition where we're able to augment our voice through working with other churches. And then the third thing that comes to mind in terms of our ongoing work is the work of our denominational task force over this past year. And I wasn't here, but I understand that one of the most powerful presentations, perhaps many of you were here, of our denominational task force that came into being after General Conference 2019 was when leaders of the Black Methodists for Church Renewal gave the history of the United Methodist Church over the last many years, and talked about the formation of the UMC in 1968 and how at that time one of the major issues teed up to be dealt with by the denomination was racism. And then you'll recall in 1972 was when the language went into our discipline about homosexuality being incompatible with Christian teaching. And in a way that issue hijacked the agenda of working on racial justice. And so in some ways, we're all recognizing that now and recognizing the opportunity to work intersectionally on racial justice and inclusivity issues at the same time. So anyway, the list goes on, and I don't need for most of you to do the whole list, but just to recognize that our relationship with Mount Zion, the book studies we've done, the Bible studies, our involvement with WIN, the Georgetown Ministry Center, that we've in many ways been involved in working for racial justice. But in terms of this morning's presentation, wanting to talk specifically about what we've done most recently, and specifically about the work of the current task force. And in some ways, our Anti-Racism Task Force traces its roots to a pledge that we took in 2020. And I wasn't here, but I'll commit this morning that I'll sign on to the pledge that you all took. An invitation that came to us through the Baltimore, Washington annual conference. And actually, Rachel, maybe you can tell people about that invitation, how that came to us from the Baltimore, Washington conference. And as I said, I wasn't here, and I don't know how it was presented to the church and how it is that we signed on.
Sure. Well, I mean, after the murder of George Floyd, I think the conference was trying to pull churches together that had some interest in working on racial justice and to resource the churches so that we could do this work more effectively. And so actually coming out of the Northeast Jurisdictional Conference, where there had been a commitment to work on racial justice. So they drew some of those resources and then created this pledge for churches to sign on to. So, I mean, I came here in July, and I think this was already up on the conference website, and we started talking about it. And the church council agreed that we should sign on to this pledge in I don't remember what month, but in the fall of 2020. And then it was sort of, Martha said, who was chairing church council at that point, said, okay, so who's gonna spearhead this? Because it needs some catalyst within the church for us to continue to do work on moving towards becoming an anti-racist church. And then, so we formed the first iteration of the Anti-Racism Task Force, which was ineffectively chaired by me. And
we had a few other things to do here.
And so we did a few things. We worked together, and this was in the midst of COVID, and I think we had a book study or two. And we had a few actions, and then we kind of went dormant until this statement, until the murder in Buffalo, and Rob McDougall really saying we need to respond, and Rob McDougall writing this wonderful statement against Christian nationalism, and then us wanting to back that up with some action. So I think that's what really spurred the revival of the Anti-Racism Task Force in its current iteration.
So thank you.
Yeah.
And the timing was just right. I had just returned from 5 years being away in New England, and I came back with no commitments, having just retired, and was talking with Rachel and said, you know what I'd really like to work on at Dumbarton is racial justice. She said, do we have an opening for you? So anyway, so that's kind of the context of the current group. And actually, let me name, we have a lot of folks committed on the task force itself, many of you here. I'll just read quickly. Rob McDougall, Ella Curry, Barbie Moreland, Ginny Lapham, Jennifer Maluski, Joe Eldridge, Elaine Friebel, except we meet on Sundays and that's a hard time for her to meet. Barbara Michaelman, Neal Taryor, Jason Reed, Kelly Coiner, Reverend Rachel, and myself as co-chairs. So that hopefully sets a quick context for what we're going to talk about this morning. And we'd like to do 4 things, if we can fit them in. One is to go back over that pledge that we signed in 2020 It was a meaty document, and it's worth remembering what we said we would commit ourselves to. And talk about some of the thoughts we've had as a task force about how we might go deeper with our work, with our anti-racism work, to share some of the ideas that we've been discussing in the task force, and then hopefully have some conversation about your ideas. What are we saying? Oh, he's here. Waving to people. So that's the plan for this morning. So really just to talk about what we've been up to and to hear from you as much as we can today, but then also to open the invitation as we continue to meet. So in terms of the pledge that we signed, it's a long pledge, so we won't read the whole thing. But you've just gone into how it came to us. So Neal and I will just go back and forth, lifting up some things in that pledge. So these are the things that Dumbarton committed to. So starting, our church will regularly uplift our shared baptismal vows to encourage believers to A, repent of the sin of racism, B, resist evil, injustice, and oppression as it relates to racism, so that C, we might be able to live into the vow to be in union with people of all ages, nations, and races.
When continues, it says, our church commits to directly engage with our local leaders and officials to work toward ending racism, poverty, violence, based upon the liberating gospel of Jesus Christ and our United Methodist social principles in our book of resolutions.
The pledge states that each church's leadership needs to engage in the work necessary and that results in naming and addressing racism when they witness it and working toward becoming a racial justice change agent.
And then it continues, we will build relationships across lines of difference as we listen deeply and get to know someone who doesn't look, think, or act like us.
Our leaders will educate themselves on how to have conversations about race.
Our leaders, once they know better, do better by exposing and eradicating racist stereotypes, naming microaggressions, speaking up. They will help others learn how to have conversations around race and use their power to talk about racial justice in worship, small groups, service ministries, including more voices at the table and creating more equity.
The pledge includes these words: racism is a sin. Our church acknowledges that perfect love casts out fear and will persist in the work of ending racism. We will seek to love all peoples as Jesus loves, whatever their racial and ethnic heritage, and work together to restore the broken body of Christ. These deep wounds can be healed, but the healing process is delicate and will require humble involvement from those who have previously remained silent.
It goes on to say that our church will discover and tell the whole truth about our church's history with regard to racism. This may include looking at the language in our deeds, tracing our church's role during the time of slavery and congregation, looking at the historical accuracy of how the images in our church depict Jesus. Truth-telling also includes confronting our racism, affirming that Black lives and all lives of color really do matter.
During a season of prayer and fasting, our church will repent and identify what change is needed to be intentionally anti-racist, given the uncomfortable truths we have discovered. We will persist even when we don't want to.
And our church will participate in vital conversations in cross-racial and our cross-cultural groups, followed by a discerned collective action in the wider community.
So this is the commitment we've already made. And as stated in the pledge, this was sent out or given to the churches as an invitation to join in and to take this pledge. And in the introduction, noted the fact that this work is not the work of a moment, that this is the work of a lifetime. So this is what the Baltimore Washington Conference has invited us into, and we have pledged to be part of. And I encourage people to go on the Baltimore Washington website and see the full pledge, but we tried to pick out the highlights. So our current anti-racism task force has talked about going deeper with our work than some of the things we've been doing, although we've been doing some remarkable things. I don't want to, sometimes people tell history like when they came into the history, and the history of our anti-racism work came when I got back from Boston. Not so. We have a long history. But during this last year, we have talked about trying to go deeper with our work. And Rachel, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, so you heard one of the things you heard lifted up in the pledge was that this is not a time for any of us to remain passive. So I think part of the work is that the Anti-Racism Task Force is not an outsourced group, right? We're not saying, oh, good on the Anti-Racism Task Force. We're doing all the work on behalf of the church. And anybody who wants to do this work should be on the Anti-Racism Task Force. No, the task force is here to catalyze the work that we are all meant to be doing. And it is, we love to study here at Dunbar. We love to learn new things, and that is a wonderful charism of this church, a spiritual gift that this church has. But this is heart work as well. And so doing things like doing a Bible study with Mount Zion and following that up with tangible action, right? Doing our stewardship series on the sum of us, and then figuring out how we use the money that we give to our budget to really fund projects that bring us together across lines of difference, right? So this is meant to be active participation of the whole congregation. And Neal's going to talk about this a little bit more, but that Ibram Kendi talks about the difference between, when he talks about anti-racism, he says there's two things. There's racism and there's anti-racism. And if we're not actively being anti-racist, we are participating in systems that perpetuate racism. And it's not that a person, it's not that you are a racist. This is not a label that we affix to ourselves as a judgment. It is it's a litmus test of every action and deed that we do in the world. When we wake up in the morning and we say, today I am going to work on being anti-racist. It's sort of like recovery, right? One day at a time, and every day we get to practice this practice of being anti-racist. And it doesn't mean that we will always be anti-racist. We live in a racist world, and we will participate in systems of racism, even while we're trying to be anti-racist. So it's sort of like the reconciling, right? I love that reconciling is a verb, right? We are a reconciling congregation. We are not a reconciled congregation. We are continuing to learn and grow. And I was talking to Jan Lawrence from RMN this week, and noticed that we have our original pledge of becoming a reconciling congregation on the wall in the office. And it says, we pledge to welcome gay men and lesbians. That's what it said 35 years ago. Now we understand reconciling to be much broader than that, right? We're working on transgender inclusion and justice for transgender kids and people of all gender identities and sexual orientations, and we see it also in this intersectional work of anti-racism, right? Because there's a lot of oppression that connects between sexual minorities and ethnic minorities in this country. So but we continue to learn and grow and do more and be involved in new ways. And I feel that this is also what the work of the Anti-Racism Task Force is, and that this pledge is. It's about us always continuing to learn and grow, connect the dots, and be engaged in becoming an anti-racist church. That's also, we did not pledge that we are an anti-racist church. We pledged to work to become an anti-racist church.
That's great. I just want to pick up on what you just said about reconciling, and I think of anti-racisting, but in terms of in Africa, there are several churches that are in conversation and becoming reconciled congregations. One that is, and in Kenya, they include in their statement solidarity and welcome of intersex children.
Wow.
Okay, because in their reality, that's what that was the initial reality. Those were the people they wanted to reach because they had been rejected from every other church. Those are the children and parents, really the children and the family system that they wanted to support. That then led to other peoples within the communities. And so I just want to share. So even reconciling looks different in different contexts. So it's that process.
Oh, can I say one more thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. So when we re-upped our reconciling statement too in 2020, right? And we adopted this new language that Reconciling Ministries Network was saying, they are asking all churches that were part of the reconciling movement or becoming part of the reconciling movement to adopt. We adopted this broader language that's in the bulletin that has to do with being in solidarity with the marginalized, with all marginalized people, right? And RMN really recognizing that the work of liberation of queer people is connected to the work of liberation of all people, and recognizing that that work has to be intersectional. So not only did we make a commitment to becoming an anti-racist church, we broadened our reconciling statement at the same time. And so I do want us to see the connection between those two things, and that RMN is seeing those connections too.
So let's just to give some more groundwork for our ongoing conversations and the work of this this area. Let's look at some definitions. And when I think of definitions, I think of parameters. I think of boundaries that sort of help, but guidelines rather than boundaries that keep us in. They're guidelines that kind of help us shape the cartography of this new land that we choose to journey in, because we don't have it fixed. We're not at the destination. We don't claim we're at the destination, but we also don't claim we're at the very beginning. We have been doing it. We want to celebrate that one, don't we? Amen. So these are the definitions or parameters that we're working with. And some of it may be new to you. Some of it, if you're like me, when you were in college or even high school, depending on our age, it was for me, and really was at divinity school, where it's like I learned definitions around racism that I now have unlearned, but they were very progressive, and they're not definitions I would be as comfortable with today. I want to suggest some of the definitions that we're working with. Some of it is informed by the work of Professor Ibram Kendi, as well as other scholars who are organic scholars, been working in communities who also are working within the academy. And so they're working in an interdisciplinary manner, just as we want to work in an intersectional manner. So here are some definitions. I want to give a definition for racism, then anti-racism, and then anti-racist. Because I think when we think about racism, if you're like me, we start to immediately think, well, am I a racist? Or how am I anti-racist personally? We're talking about that balance between systems and policies and individual ideas, and then behaviors and practices. So here's some language that's informed by Kendi, but it's not limited. A powerful, so by racism, this is what we're talking about. A powerful collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity and are substantiated by racist ideas. So note that language, because we're going to come back to it in the next 2 minutes. Ideas and practices, ideas and policies. Racist is not a pejorative. It is not the equivalent of a slur. It is descriptive. It's meant to describe behavior. Someone who is supporting racist policies or expressing racist ideas. That's perpetuating racism. Other definitions you may be more familiar with are these. Racism is defined by race prejudice, plus social and institutional power or access to social and institutional power. Another iteration of that is this. Racism equals a system of advantage based on race or privilege. Third iteration would be this. Racism, a system of oppression based on race. And then a final one would be racism, a white supremacist system. So those are additional ways to get this larger definition. Racism is different from racial prejudice, hatred, or discrimination. Racism involves one group having the power to carry out systematic discrimination through the institutional policies and practices of society by shaping the cultural beliefs and values that support those racist policies and practices. So the ability to reinforce those values, the ideas that support policies and practices. So that's the living definition around racism. So what do we mean by anti-racist? This is a newer language. Well, again, when I was in high school, when I was in college, when I was in divinity school, we didn't talk about being anti-racist. We talked about people recovering from racism. We had all sorts of it. But anti-racism is fairly new in our lexicon, and we want to introduce that to this congregation. So what do we mean by anti-racism? Anti-racism is an active stance, and one is anti-racist, as Rachel had said, when one is expressing anti-racist ideas or actively supporting anti-racist policies. Policies and those with power to implement and change policies should be the primary target or focus of anti-racist actions. People can and do, and I love this line in all of Kenny's work, I love this line. People can and do regularly support both racist ideas and racist
ideas and anti-racist.
And anti-racist ideas. Sometimes in back-to-back sentences, okay? Or back-to-back actions, okay? This means that each moment presents us with a choice to act in anti-racist ways that our past choices and actions do not define our potential, yeah? So we have the opportunity every moment. Anti-racist. Someone who is supporting anti-racist policies through their actions or expressing anti-racist ideas. It goes on to say racist and anti-racist are like peelable name tags that are placed and replaced based on what someone is doing or what they're not doing, supporting or expressing in each moment. These are not permanent tattoos of that line too. No one becomes a racist or anti-racist. No one becomes a racist or anti-racist. We can only strive to be one or the other. Like fighting an addiction, being an anti-racist requires persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, regular self-examination. So those are the working definitions.
Great, thanks. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and ask you all to share with one another for a few minutes. Some of you have done this before. I've done it several times and find that I share different things each time. What we're going to ask you to share about is when you first became aware of your racial identity, your race or your ethnicity. Those of us that did the series, Seeing White, many of you participated in that Seeing White series that we did last winter, I guess. And we talked about the notion of race being a human construct. It's not something that's been the same over time, that it's been something that human beings have constructed over time. But the fact that it's a human construct, it's still very real in terms of how it influences our behavior, our notion of race. But let's take a minute to just turn to the person next to you and share with them the first time you became aware that you were our white, black, Asian, fill in the blank, whatever ethnic identity. And we'll do this for about 6 minutes, 3 minutes each, not a long thing, but just to share.
And for those who are on Zoom, if you will mute yourselves and Roger will lead the discussion. We will not have time for everybody on Zoom, but you will have your chance to think about it. So please go ahead with that as well.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Would somebody repeat the two tasks? that we have? The first one is, when did you become aware of your racial status? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what do you think? What is the second one, just so we'll keep that in mind too? Or did I miss something?
I'm not sure I heard a second question specifically.
Yeah, well, so when did we find out that, I mean, be aware of our being the white race somehow, and there were other races?
Probably elementary school, when there were people of other races in the school.
Yeah, there were none in my school. I grew up in Fairfax County, and I wasn't aware that there were separate water fountains and things like that as a elementary kid.
But we didn't have separate. So.
No, you would, yeah, well,
New York, yeah,
it's just that also I'm older.
yeah.
Yeah, it was.
So when was it for you, Roger?
I think actually it wasn't until after college, maybe even. I mean,
Really?
college, I just always had the thing that we are Earthlings, and so race is just something that we shouldn't dwell on or acknowledge in our minds. Now I've grown to hear the black people, friends that I have, saying, no, you should be aware. And that's what I think they were talking about at the desk. Be aware that there are other races and that they have the right to power and things like that too, which is a little confusing for somebody who just wants to be an anthropologist and look at the evolution from the point of an alien, and saying, really, we're all human beings, so that makes us equal, should make us equal. And when we greet people, we should treat them as equals.
That's only one kind of a anthropologist that you just described. The other one is you go into a community and see how they describe themselves,
Yes.
because you want to understand how they can not agree with you, and
Yeah.
how what they do believe actually helps them to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And so, John, when were you first aware of race?
Well, I happen to have the only Black family living on my street, several doors down. And for a while, I called their eldest son my best friend. Now, how that came not to be is an interesting story that you don't have to hear. But if you have your eyes open and you shake a hand, you see a difference in skin color. Didn't matter. And then later on in school, I learned about slavery and Reconstruction and how that was cut short. And then from there on, all of the social controversies.
Yeah, but in elementary school, they were just, different kids.
Yeah, and that was my experience too. I was in a very mixed neighborhood and school, and so I remember there were always Black we were playing with as well as white kids. But where it really struck me more was when I went to college, and I was sitting in my first big lecture hall, and it felt very strange. And then I realized at the end of the session, almost everybody there was white. There were very few Blacks. And it was particularly striking because as I was leaving the lecture hall, one of the Black kids who I had known in high school passed by. And so he was one of the few. And I remember being struck by how odd that felt
I came from Midwest Ohio. My grade school, I don't remember any Black children in my grade school. My neighborhood, now, when I was older, I realized I lived on the white side of town. So grade school, neighborhood, I knew Black people existed, but I did not encounter them until junior high. When there were only 2 junior high schools in the whole town. And they kind of split the town in half, and the kids on one side all went to one and all the other. Well, the people on my side of town, that encompassed those who lived on the wrong side of the tracks. And so 7th grade was the first time I went to school with Black students. And it was no big deal. We had gym together, we had choir, chorus together, all our classes. And I think going from the anti-racist workbook that I have from Kamau Bell, the big thing was, when did I realize that I was white and why that made me different was when somebody Black asked me on a date and my mother pitched a hiss fit.
Okay. Call ourselves that. So I hope I gather that was fruitful. We talked talking with one another. And if we had time, it would be great to hear people's reflections on that. But unfortunately, we're squeezed into this time frame, so we won't get to talk about that. I did want to share a little bit of my own story. I said that as I've done this over the years and done this same thing, it's felt to me like peeling back the layers of an onion. And like the first time I think I did this, I remember talking about an experience of going with my mom. She was a substitute teacher at that time. And one day I had to go with her. I wasn't a babysitter or whatever. And so my first experience of seeing a Black person was in that classroom that I went to with my mother that day. And I shared that as saying that was the first time I became aware of being white. And then the next time I thought about it, I thought, actually, I can become aware or understand myself as white. That experience let me know there were people with different skin colors in the world, but I didn't really reflect on what, me being white. Then as I over time have shared, I realize where I am right now, and this might change the next time I do the exercise, I don't know, but is thinking that it wasn't until high school when in the New England Annual Conference, there was a group of leaders doing something they called consultations on racism. And they were day-long workshops and got pretty in-depth about different issues of racism. And so I had taken one of these day-long workshops, and then there was an evening program. And I don't even remember what the program was about. We took a bus to Natick, Mass. But after this day of being educated about systemic racism and how racism is manifest in systems, it was sinking in over the day how I was a part of this. And by that evening, it really sunk in. And I now think of that as the point that I became aware I was white. Because the definition we were using at the time, we've gone through all these definitions, the definition we were using at the time was the one, racism equals racial prejudice plus social and institutional power. And I knew that growing up white in America, that I had racial prejudice, whether I wanted to or not, but that was something that I had learned, and that I had institutional power, I had privilege. And that night, it's really sunk in that this was something that I couldn't just change. This was kind of what we're talking about now. It's the work of a lifetime, when it sinks in that deep. And so now I think that's the first time I became aware I was white. So I think for all of us, this understanding of our racial identity, whatever it is, I think it continues to evolve, and as we learn more and share more. Anyway, that was a part of my story of how that has evolved in my life. So, now we don't have time. I wish I could ask each one of you what your story is in your little dyad. But before our time is up, do we end at 10 up or?
Officially at 10:45, so.
Okay, so we're ending. Okay, so we want to get this part in. We want to talk about currently what the Anti-Racism Task Force is talking about and doing. And Rachel mentioned the statement that Rob crafted around Christian nationalism and racist violence. We're going to do more with that. It's up on our website, but we're having trouble getting into our website. We need to make some corrections to it on the website. We're having trouble getting in there, but there will be more discussion of that. And that statement also has a list of actions that go with it. So with the congregation, we'll be talking more about that. The next major thing that we're talking about and working on right now is to work with the General Commission on Religion and Race to do a racism audit of Dumbarton. And what that involves is really examining many different aspects of our congregation, looking at our geographic neighborhood and the racial makeup of our geographic neighborhood and of our congregation, and what opportunities there are to be in ministry, and how we're doing it that, looking at our church leadership and how that reflects or doesn't reflect racial diversity and anti-racism. Asking the question as a predominantly white, we are a predominantly white congregation, but we are not an entirely white congregation. So thinking about and talking about what that means and the experience of people of color being part of a predominantly white congregation, and what people might have to teach us and what we might have to learn about that. G-Corps will help us look at our communications, our website, our bulletin, our e-chips, etc. And what are we communicating through those forms about being anti-racist or not anti-racist? How are we living that through our communications, and looking at our ministries? So those are the things that G-Corps will help us look at. Some of the other things that we might look at is how our budget reflects our commitment to anti-racism. If we say we're an anti-racist church, how are we spending our money, and how is that reflected? So this period of time of really kind of examining where the rubber hits the road, and how we take action, how we spend our money, how we communicate to folks, and what that has to say about our commitment to anti-racism. And then that's what we're talking about right now. Then we have a whole list of other actions of when we talk about looking at our ministries, of looking at the things that we've been talking about, our participation in Georgetown Ministries, etc. Where can we be most effective being a change agent and making an anti-racist witness, and looking at the things we're already involved in and what might we want to be more involved in or less involved in. Let's see. and just providing opportunities for us to channel our collective energies to turn our commitment to anti-racism into effective means of being agents of change in the broader community. So that's really in a nutshell what we've been up to. So sorry I went over.
Okay, before we thank our presenters for today, I want to acknowledge that we have some people here who have not yet been to a second Sunday celebration. It happens every month, and we have one coming up next Sunday. The second Sunday celebration is not on Zoom, but it is at the adult ed time, and it is for all ages, and there are activities for all ages and opportunities for reflection, plus refreshments. We don't normally do. So hope that we will be seeing you next time. For now, let's thank our presenters for. And if you would please put your chairs back on your way up the stairs to the